Hey, fourth graders, we're going to pick up where we left off yesterday and learn about the second part of the War of 1812. When we last spoke, the British had just attacked Washington, D.C., burning many important buildings, including the White House itself. Now, what was their plan? After D.C., the British were hoping to go to the city of Baltimore, which was a really important port city right there on the water, to seize Baltimore, take it over, and they were hoping that would end the war as a victory for the British. Unfortunately for them, there were some leaders in Baltimore that were not willing to surrender so easily, including Major General Samuel Smith. And he convinced all of the ship owners who had ships in the Baltimore harbor at the time to sink their own ships in anticipation of the British coming. Now, why would they do that? That seems a little silly. Well, imagine these big British warships coming into the Baltimore harbor, and there are sunken ships just under the surface. Yeah, they couldn't get through. They couldn't get close enough to the city to do the damage they were hoping to do because all of those ships created like an underwater wall that the ships couldn't pass through. Pretty clever, right? So this guy was another leader in Baltimore, Major George Armistead, and he commanded Fort McHenry. Fort McHenry looked like this. It was shaped like a star. There were cannons pointing in every direction, and you might notice this enormous flag right here. He hired someone, a woman named Mary Pickersgill, to sew this huge flag, and it was so big that she couldn't even fit it in her workshop when she was creating it. It's an enormous flag. And so she got the help of her 13-year-old daughter, Caroline, and they had to sew it in a brewery where there was enough space. Just to give you guys an idea of how huge this flag was, each of these white stars was about 2 feet across. Wow. So one of the biggest flags in the country is flying at Fort McHenry. That's going to be important in just a minute. So a year later, the British finally were preparing to attack Baltimore, and there was an American lawyer named Francis Scott Key and another guy, American, named John Skinner. They went up to a British ship, and they were trying to get their friend, Dr. William Beans, off the ship. He was captured by the British, and they had agreed to release him, but they said that all 3 of the Americans had to stay on the ship until the British were finished attacking Baltimore. So they really didn't have a choice. All they could do was watch as the British Navy fired these huge cannons and bombs and rockets at Fort McHenry all night. Lucky for Baltimore, all of those ships that were sunk in the harbor kept those warships from getting too close to the city, and they really couldn't do that much damage. But these 3 guys watching from the ship didn't really know that. It was dark. It was smoky. As far as they knew, their Baltimore was being destroyed. So they were witnessing this very scary event from on board the ship of the enemy, and they wondered what they'd see the next day. So the fighting went on for about 25 hours, so just over a full day. And in the early morning light, it became clear to Mr. Key, who was looking through his telescope, that that giant flag was still flying at Fort McHenry. So what did that mean? Well, it meant that the Americans had won the battle. Francis Scott Key was so overcome with joy that he decided to write a poem. And this poem was titled The Defense of Fort McHenry. But eventually, they would be set to music. The words would be set to music and become our national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner. I bet you guys know that song. So Americans were super happy, relieved that Baltimore had defeated this British attack. That really took off some of the pressure. In fact, there was a treaty signed not long after that ended the war. Now, of course, you know from learning about the American Revolution, news travels really slowly at this time. So even after the war technically officially ended, there was one more battle, and this was a doozy right here in New Orleans along the Gulf of Mexico. So at the Battle of New Orleans, General Andrew Jackson this is him, defeated the British with the help of some free African Americans, even with the help of some Native Americans. And in this battle, over 2,000 British soldiers died, and there were only 13 American deaths. And this was an unfortunate thing that happened because the war had technically already ended. So that's a lot of lives to be lost for really seemingly no reason. But it put this guy on the map, and he became somewhat of a hero in America at the time. Do you recognize him, Andrew Jackson? Maybe this picture will help. Is it ringing a bell? He's on our $20 bill. And he's going to go on to become president of the United States and do some other stuff that we're going to talk about in this unit. He's a very controversial figure in American history, and you'll find out why. But I don't want to spoil anything that's coming up next, so I'll keep talking about the War of 1812. So here's a painting of that war. It was very, very bad for the British. But this war, and especially that battle at New Orleans, kind of put Americans on the map as a world power. People all over the world, countries all over the world, realized they needed to take the United States seriously. This was an independent nation that even the greatest powers in Europe had to respect. And that gave Americans a great sense of pride, patriotism, and of course, another result of it was that now we have the national anthem, the Star Spangled Banner. Here is that flag, and it's pretty interesting. You can actually go see this today in Washington, D.C. in the Smithsonian. So if you've ever been to Washington, D.C. in the Museum of American History, it's there. You can check it out, and hopefully it will last for generations to come.
So there's the story of the War of 1812. But wait, that's not the whole story. History, as you may have noticed by now, is usually written and down and recorded by the winners. So who lost out the most during the War of 1812, or as a result of that war? Was it the British? No, definitely wasn't the Americans. And it wasn't even the French. The voices missing in this story are those of the American Indians, who also happen to be the group of people who lost out the most as a result of this war. This war broke Great Britain's ties with the tribes living here in the Northwest Territory. These tribes didn't have any defenses against the United States continuing their mission of westward expansion. Settlers began pouring into the Western territories, and more conflicts with American Indians soon followed. By now, the native people of this land had learned that American settlers were bad news, and they tried to fight to keep their land and their way of life. The skirmishes and clashes and conflicts between white settlers and American Indians trying to defend their land just got worse and worse. And this really only made the settlers see American Indians as the enemy and a problem that needed to be eliminated. Often, the United States Army got involved in battles with American Indian tribes fighting to defend their land. Here are just a few. This slide and the next are some of the leaders of Native American tribes who fought for their survival, fought for the survival of their culture, their land during this era of westward expansion by settlers from the United States. This is Geronimo, part of the Apache tribe. Sitting Bull, Lakota. Crazy Horse, also Lakota. Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce. Red Cloud of the Sioux. So you can imagine this pattern of settlers moving into the American Indian territories. Conflicts are rising, and the army coming in to force the American Indians off their land further and further west, where they would no longer be in the way of the settlers. Unfortunately, there always seemed to be a reason why settlers eventually needed those lands too. One of the most horrific of these removals of American Indians from their land took place right here in Georgia, among other places, and was started by the War of 1812 war hero himself, Andrew Jackson. He was president at the time, and we're going to learn more about this event later, but his sinister actions toward the Native Americans will cause many to question whether he really deserves to be honored on our $20 bill or not. But as I said, more on that later in our unit. So think back to when you did this map activity at the beginning of our westward expansion studies. Were you right about some of the problems that might come up? Of course, we're not done talking about this, but I just wanted to jog your memory in case you had anything to add. So here are a few things to remember about the War of 1812. This is a war that is often forgotten in U.S. history, and a lot of grown-ups maybe would have trouble telling you what it was all about and what the results were. But here are some really important outcomes. Americans held their own in this war and really proved themselves to be a world power. Other countries started to take us seriously after this. Dolly Madison, First Lady, saved precious items from the burning White House, including a portrait of George Washington. Francis Scott Key wrote the Star-Spangled Banner, which we hear still today. And the Native people of America lost out the most as a result of this war, opening up the rest of the continent for westward expansion.